Hello, I'm Daniela. Today's slow stitching video is a continuation in the Charming Birds series. In the first video, I showed you start to finish ways to create a fabric charming bird, full of personality. I also showed some variations. In the next video, I showed variations on creating the wings. And in the next video, variations on creating the beaks. But today, I'm going to show variations on creating the tails. And 3 of them use embroidery floss, and 3 of them use fabric. And there are variations within those as well. I really hope this inspires you to create your own. So let's get started. So here we have the 6 birds. In the previous videos, we've stitched the beaks with different beaks, giving different personalities, and the different wing formations and different wing dimensions. So that's kind of an interesting effect. Now today we're going to finish off by adding different tails. In the original video for the Charming Birds, which of course I'll link below along with the others, we have a tail that we ruffled the fabric and then stitch it down just to give it a little dimension. So we're going to continue our work with the fabric first, and then we'll work on some embroidery floss tails. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to take the pink thread that we used for the wings, and we're just going to create a shape. And the shape could be anything. It could be a fan shape, or it could be a heart shape, or it could just be a little triangle. We'll do a little heart. And so I like to make my hearts by I just make half of the heart, and then I fold my fabric right down that center line. And this kind of gives me a symmetrical heart. So I have my heart here. I could just tuck it underneath my fabric, and then I can stitch it down. Now I'll zoom right in, just like I will for all of these techniques. And so you can decide if you want your heart to be on top of your body or underneath. So there's some variation right there. And then you can decide if you want to stitch around your heart or leave it up. Now I'm going to tuck that heart fairly deep on that tail. I'm not going to stitch around it up top, at least not on this one. So what I'd like to do is just take my green embroidery floss, the same color that I used to stitch around the body, and I'm just going to continue to stitch around the body because I left the tails unstitched, or the tail area unstitched, so that I could tuck a tail if I chose. And if I don't want to tuck the tail, I don't have to either. So I'm going to take my thread, holding my tail in place. In this case, the shape is a heart. And I just want to make my stitches, and I want to make sure I really grip through that fabric on that heart to hold it in place. I can always add a few stitches if I decide it's not really secure, but I like to add a few stitches around just to complete that outline of the body. And then I'll make a knot on the back. So there we have our first bird completed, along with that little cute tail feather. And again, you could alter the shape to make it any shape that you want. Now for our next tail, I want this tail, instead of being ruffled like we had on the original design, I want it to be folded. So I'm going to take my fabric, just cut a piece, kind of in the rectangular shape. I'll round the edges. And now I'm just going to fold it over on itself just a few times until I'm happy with the way it looks. I can come back in, make more of an arc, or even fold it on itself again so that it really tucks very well underneath that bird. So once I have it tucked to what I think is the right size, and I think that looks good, I'll hold it down, take some embroidery floss, and just sew a stitch or two just to hold it in place. I don't have to knot it. I can just make a little cut here because I'm going to use my green embroidery floss and just stitch over the edge again, just like we did on the first one. trim that down. When I find the spot that I like for that tail, I'll be sure to hold it in place, and then I'll start from the outside and really just make sure my stitches go through all those layers of fabric on that tail. And I want to do this in a couple of spots just to make it really secure. I'll continue stitching around. And once I have that done, I think I can come back in here and add just a few more stitches right around the edge where the tail and the body meet. So I'll just stitch a few more stitches, and I can use whatever color I like for this. I happen to like the green. Make my stitches a little bit smaller. And then I'll knot it on the back. And so there we have a second tail with folded fabric. We have the shape, and then we have the folded fabric. So now for our third tail, I want to create another shape, but I want it to go long, and I want to stitch around the edge. So I'm going to take my fabric, I'm going to create a long fan shaped, so kind of a rectangle with one rounded edge, just like this. And I think I'm going to fold it just once in the center so that it will fit underneath this fabric quite nicely, just like this. And now I'm going to take my green thread at first and stitch around to hold it down into position. And then I'm going to stitch around the edge with some pink thread. So again, I'm holding it in position. Starting on the edge here, closest to the wing. Just making a couple of stitches. Again, when I get close enough to the fabric tail, I want to make sure my stitches go through the fabric, just to really hold it in place. Then I'll knot off the thread just on the back of the bird. And I'll take my embroidery floss and just stitch around the perimeter of this tail. I'll hold it in place. I'll start at the closest area to the bird, making my little stitches, and then I'll show you how it looks when it's all stitched around the perimeter. So now for our next bird, I want to stitch, using embroidery floss, some three-dimensional little loops. So I'm going to start with my color that matches my wing. Again, you can use whatever color you want. So I'm going to start here underneath where the body would be, and I'll create my first stitch. And then I'm just going to create a loop. So I'm going to pull it out, make that loop, and have it come down next to that place that we went in to create that loop. And from here, I'll decide how long I want that loop to be. So I like that length for the loop. I'm going to come up in between where I just put that loop down, and then I'll make another loop. And I'll come down just a little bit below that first loop. Again, I'm playing with the size, and then I'm going to come back in and make a third loop. Again, all with this pink color. Try and slide it out. So now I have 3 loops, and they'll twist and get a little tangled, and that's okay. So they're all underneath that body. And this one's sticking out a little bit, but it's not a problem. I'll come around here, very carefully knot my thread. I don't want to tighten the loops that I made because at this point they're not secured. So now you could stop here and just stitch around your body with your green thread, but I want to come in there with thread that's just 1 shade darker than the existing pink. And I'm going to come in and just in front, closest to the body, I'm going to stitch 3 more loops. So my loops are going to be a little tighter, and they're going to be just a little shorter than the ones we made. So I'm going to make my first loop, and it's just barely shorter than the ones we made. I'll come back in between that first loop, create that second loop, keeping it very tight to that first loop, keeping it approximately the same size, and then I'll make 1 more. And pull it down. And now I'm going to knot it on the back. Again, I'm careful not to pull it tighter than it is already because nothing is securing these knots down. So now I have some interesting loops and texture here, kind of a little nest of embroidery floss. I'm going to take my green embroidery floss that I used for the body and continue to stitch around, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. So there we have our completed bird. By stitching around the perimeter and hooking into those loops, we've kind of secured it somewhat. So now for our next technique, we're going to make those loops again, but we're going to secure them down. So I'm going to take my pink that matches my wing, and again I'm going to start underneath the tail area here. And I'm going to make 3 loops, and I'm going to choose whatever length I want for those loops. So I'll make my first loop, pulling it down. I'll come in just a little tighter, and then I'm just going to come up here just like a daisy stitch and secure that loop with a little stitch on the end. And that secures it in place. And then I'll come back right to where I started and make 2 more of those. Start with the first one, I make my loop, and then I just secure it exactly where I want it to be. I like to make that center loop the longest, and then the 2 beneath it and above it to be just slightly shorter. And it gives kind of a rounded effect. Makes the tail look rounded. And then I just make my stitch, and I can knot it on the back. So now my loops are secure. I can go in there with my green thread and finish stitching all the way around the bird. And there we have our 5th version of a tail. So now for our last tail, we're going to stitch something so it looks kind of like feathers. It's not the feather stitch, but it is something indicative of the feathers for the tail. So you choose the number that you want. You can do 3 or 4 or 5. I'm going to do 3. And once again, I'm going to make that center tail feather the longest, and then I'm just going to create 2 shorter tail feathers. So now what I want to do is take my 2 colors of thread that I used here, and I'm going to start by making the darker color closest to the body and the lighter color further away. So what I like to do is start on the bottom feather. I start just beneath where the actual fabric from the body will come out, and I'm just going to stitch 1 stitch approximately 1/4 of an inch long, And then I'm going to come right to the side of that stitch, maybe 1/8 of the way back to where I had originally stitched, and stitched out just one more stitch. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Again, I'll start a little closer to the center this time. And I'm going to stitch a couple more stitches coming from the body right up to that center area for that longer tail feather. So then I come back and I stitch just to the side of it, of that first stitch, maybe 1/8 of an inch back. And I'm going to stitch just a little bit longer than that stitch I made for the first tail feather. And then I'm going to come back in again, and I'm going to stitch for the top tail feather. So I'll make my first stitch, and then I'm going to make my second stitch, keeping it just slightly underneath that first stitch and slightly shy of the depth of that second stitch. So that's the beginning of my tail feathers that I'm stitching with embroidery floss. You can make another stitch for each one of those tail feathers if you want, but I'm going to switch to my lighter color pink. I knot off the back of the thread, and these stitches are secure. And now I'm going to take my lighter color pink, and again, you can use whatever colors you want. I'm going to go just to the other side of that lower tail feather, and I'm going to stitch one time going in the direction of that sketch that I made. And then I'm going to come back on to the right of it, just a short little ways, and make another stitch, the length that we sketched out. I'm going to move over here, again, just beneath that first darker pink tail feather, stitch it a quarter of an inch or so, and then I'm going to come up just to the right of it, 1/8 of an inch below where that stitch ended, and create our next stitch. And I'll do the same thing over here. I start just below where we started, make my 1/4 of an inch stitch, go above it, and just back from where we ended that stitch, just like this. And now I have some tail feathers. You could come down and continue to add color by taking that stitch and bringing it closer to that darker tail feather. And I'll do the same thing over here. So whatever you do on one tail feather, just remember to do on all of them. And then I'll do one more over here. And you can make this as full as you want. I'm quite happy with the way that looks. I'll flip it over and knot my thread. And so there we have our final stitched tail feather. Now I'll show all of the variations of the tail feathers that we worked on. So here's the original tail feather that we worked on the original video, and here are variations on that technique, whether you ruffle the fabric or fold it, whether you use embroidery floss or multiple stitches. So those are 6 variations for the tails to use on your charming birds. Each variation will make the bird unique and have a little character, a little personality. Sometimes it's a little wonky and flirtatious, sometimes it's silly, and sometimes it's very serious. You make the decisions and you choose how you want your charming bird to look. If you'd like me to take a look at your bird, just snap a photo of it and upload it onto Instagram and be sure to tag me. I'd love to see what you create. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.